On a granite plateau in southern Africa sits the largest stone structure built anywhere south of the Sahara before the modern era, walls rising 11 meters high, curving for 250 meters without a single drop of mortar holding any of it together. The people who built it called their land, in their own language, the Houses of Stone. For most of the 20th century, the people who ruled over it insisted someone else must have built it instead. This is Great Zimbabwe, and tonight we're going to sit with two mysteries at once, because they turn out to be tangled together in a way that's almost impossible to separate. One is a genuine archaeological puzzle, how a medieval African society, without wheels, without a written script of its own, without draft animals suited to hauling stone, cut and stacked hundreds of thousands of granite blocks into walls precise enough to still be standing 800 years later. The other mystery isn't really about the stones at all. It's about why, for the better part of a century, an enormous amount of effort went into insisting the answer to the first question couldn't possibly be the obvious one. Ask most people to name an ancient African civilization and, if they can name one at all, it's almost always Egypt, a genuinely remarkable place that nonetheless sits at the very northern edge of an entire continent's history, as if nothing comparable happened anywhere else on the map. Great Zimbabwe is one of the clearest rebuttals to that assumption, a medieval African city that engineered dry stone architecture on a monumental scale, ran a trade economy stretching to the far side of the Indian Ocean, and then had its own authorship actively argued away for the better part of a century by the very people who claimed to be studying it. Let's start with what still stands, because the scale of it tends to surprise people who've never heard of the place before. Great Zimbabwe sits near the modern city of Masvingo, and it isn't one building but a sprawling complex of at least 3 major sections. The hill complex, the earliest part, occupies a rocky granite outcrop overlooking the valley, likely serving as an early royal residence and ceremonial center. Climb the narrow, winding stone passageways of the hill complex today and you're walking the same route the ruling household once used to move between private chambers, audience spaces, and lookout points commanding a clear view over the entire valley below, a piece of urban planning built as much for authority and privacy as for shelter. Down below sits the valley complex, a scattered network of enclosures where much of the ordinary population likely lived. And then there's the great enclosure, the structure people usually picture when they hear the name at all, an outer wall curving in a long, deliberate ellipse, built from evenly coursed granite blocks, quarried locally from the same granite that forms the hills around it, split along natural fracture lines by alternating fire and water rather than any metal tool, then dressed and stacked with a precision that has held the wall together, without mortar, for the better part of a millennium. The stoneworking technique itself is worth pausing on. Builders exploited the way local granite naturally splits along flat horizontal seams when heated with fire and then rapidly cooled with water, cracking it into workable slabs without any metal chisel or saw ever touching it. Those slabs were then dressed by hand and laid in even, level courses, each wall subtly battered, angled slightly inward as it rises, a technique that spreads the structure's weight in a way that has helped these walls survive centuries of rain, tremors, and root growth without any mortar to hold the individual stones together at all. Nowhere else in the region, before or after, does the same technique appear at anything close to this scale. Inside the great enclosure stands its strangest feature, a solid, tapering stone tower, roughly 9 meters tall, serving no obvious practical purpose at all. It isn't hollow. Nobody climbed it, stored anything in it, or used it as a lookout point. Its most widely discussed interpretations lean toward the symbolic, a monumental granary shape representing the accumulated grain and cattle wealth that likely underwrote the whole society, or a fertility symbol tied to the ruling dynasty's authority. Nobody has found an inscription, carving, or written explanation anywhere on the site clarifying which reading, if either, is correct. It simply stands there, solid and deliberate, exactly the kind of detail a culture only bothers building when everyone already understands what it means, and says nothing to anyone who comes later without that shared context. At its height, likely sometime between the 12th and 15th centuries, Great Zimbabwe may have held somewhere between 10 and 20,000 residents, making it one of the largest urban centers anywhere in medieval sub-Saharan Africa. And it wasn't wealthy by isolation. It was wealthy because of exactly the opposite, a genuinely long-distance trade network stretching from this inland granite plateau all the way to the Indian Ocean coast and, from there, out across the water entirely. Life on the plateau ran on a rhythm built around cattle long before it ran on gold. Herds were kept close to the royal enclosures, penned within their own stone-walled kraals, and the size of a family's herd translated directly into social standing, marriage arrangements, and political influence, in much the same way land ownership or accumulated coin might function in other medieval societies elsewhere in the world. Grain stores, likely echoed symbolically by that solid tower inside the great enclosure, mattered just as much, a hedge against the region's unpredictable rainfall and the difference, in a bad year, between a community that held together and one that didn't. Cattle formed the backbone of local wealth and status, the way land or gold might function elsewhere, but gold is what tied Great Zimbabwe to the wider world. Gold mined from the surrounding region moved overland toward the coastal trading city of Sofala, in what's now Mozambique, where Swahili merchants folded it into an Indian Ocean trading system that already connected East Africa to Arabia, Persia, India, and China. We know this because of what traveled back in the other direction. Excavators at Great Zimbabwe have recovered Persian and Near Eastern glazed pottery, glass beads manufactured in India, and fragments of Chinese celadone porcelain, delicate, specifically made goods that crossed an ocean and then several hundred more kilometers inland, simply to end up in the hands of people living on this one granite plateau in the African interior. Picture the caravan route itself for a moment, porters and traders moving gold dust, worked ornaments, and raw ivory down off the plateau, through savanna and lowland forest, toward a coastline most of Great Zimbabwe's own residents likely never personally saw, where Swahili merchants loaded it onto dhows bound up the coast and across open water, returning months or years later with exactly the kind of small, delicate, unmistakably foreign objects that tell archaeologists today just how far this one hilltop's economic reach actually extended. Among the objects recovered here, 8 carved soapstone birds, each perched atop a tall stone monolith, stand out as the site's most evocative surviving artwork, generally thought to represent a battler eagle or fish eagle closely tied to Shona spiritual tradition, possibly serving as royal or ancestral emblems marking the presence and authority of the ruling lineage. Today, one of these birds appears on Zimbabwe's national flag and coat of arms, a striking continuity considering how thoroughly the birds themselves were scattered during the colonial period that followed. Prospectors and colonial administrators associated with Cecil Rhodes's British South Africa Company removed most of the birds from the site in the 1890s, and for decades several sat in private collections in South Africa, including for a long stretch at Rhodes's own estate near Cape Town. One bird in particular sat for decades inside Rhodes's private garden at his Cape Town estate, Groot Sure, admired as decoration by visitors who had no idea it had been carved half a continent away to stand watch over a royal enclosure, not a colonial garden path. Most of the birds were eventually returned to Zimbabwe across the 20th century, but that particular piece wasn't repatriated until 1981, a year after independence, a slow, partial homecoming for objects that had never been meant to leave the hill they were carved to watch over. If you've been enjoying tonight's walk through a genuinely underappreciated corner of the ancient world, this is a good moment to hit subscribe, especially if the idea of a lost trade capital connecting an African granite plateau to Persian glassmakers and Chinese porcelain kilns is exactly the kind of thing that helps your mind drift tonight. And if you're still awake enough to type, I'd love to know in the comments what part of tonight's story surprised you most. Now, quietly, back to the stones, and to the argument that followed them. Because here's where the second mystery starts, and it has almost nothing to do with archaeology and almost everything to do with politics. When the German explorer Karl Mach became the first European to widely publicize the ruins in 1871, he arrived already convinced he'd stumbled onto the biblical Queen of Sheba's palace, going so far as to identify a piece of local wood as cedar, imported all the way from Lebanon in his imagination, purely because he refused to believe a structure this impressive could be made from anything sourced locally by local hands. From there, the theories multiplied: Phoenician traders, Arab merchants, refugees from Sheba's court, the entire site occasionally proposed as the lost land of Ophir mentioned in scripture as the source of King Solomon's gold. None of these were neutral scholarly guesses. The territory itself had recently been named Rhodesia, after Cecil Rhodes, whose British South Africa company controlled it, and in the 1890s that same company chartered something called the Ancient Ruins Company, granting it formal rights to dig through Great Zimbabwe and other regional sites purely to extract gold artifacts for profit, destroying an enormous amount of irreplaceable archaeological context in the process. A ready-made European or Near Eastern origin story for the region's most impressive ancient monument fit conveniently well with an ideology built around justifying white minority rule over a land supposedly incapable, on its own, of this level of achievement. Actual archaeology settled the question far earlier than colonial policy was willing to admit. In 1905, the archaeologist David Randall McIver excavated at the site and concluded plainly that it was of African origin, built within the last 1,000 years or so, not by any ancient foreign civilization. In 1929, Gertrude Cotton Thompson conducted a more thorough and rigorously documented excavation, and reached exactly the same conclusion, stating it about as firmly as an archaeologist can: the evidence for foreign builders simply wasn't there, and every material signature pointed to indigenous Bantu-speaking Africans, ancestors of the modern Shona people, as the builders. And still, for decades afterward, the Rhodesian government pressured museums, guidebooks, and school curricula to downplay or outright omit that conclusion, preferring vaguer, unresolved framing that left room for the older foreign origin myths to linger in the public imagination. Museum information panels at the site itself were reportedly edited under official pressure to soften or remove the finding of local authorship, and popular guidebooks sold to tourists well into the 1960s continued quietly hedging on a question the excavators themselves had already answered with real confidence decades earlier. It's a strange kind of mystery, in the end, not one where the evidence was missing, but one where the evidence existed, was published, and was simply overruled by the people with the authority to decide what the public got to read. It wasn't until Zimbabwe's independence in 1980, and the deliberate choice of a new national name meaning, roughly, Houses of Stone, that the site's authorship stopped being treated as a politically inconvenient answer and became, instead, a foundation stone of the country's own national identity. So, with the who mostly settled, one real mystery remains: why the city itself was eventually abandoned, sometime around the 15th or 16th century, after roughly 3 or 4 centuries of being one of the most important places in the region. No destruction layer, no burned citadel, no invading army anywhere in the archaeological record marks Great Zimbabwe's decline. The evidence instead points toward the same kind of layered, gradual unwinding we've walked through in other episodes on this channel. The population the plateau supported at its height may simply have outgrown what the surrounding land could sustainably provide, exhausting soil, grazing land, and firewood across generations of dense occupation. Around the same period, the region's gold trade networks appear to have shifted, with new political centers rising to the north and southwest, drawing trade and influence away from this one granite hilltop rather than eliminating it outright. Political power seems to have fragmented rather than collapsed, splitting into successor states, the Kingdom of Matapa to the north and the Torwa state further southwest, both of which inherited the same stone-building tradition and, in Torwa's case at the later site of Kami, built new dry stone capitals of their own using techniques passed down directly from Great Zimbabwe's builders. That detail is worth sitting with for a moment, because it reframes the whole ending. This wasn't a civilization erased. It was a civilization's center of gravity shifting elsewhere, its architectural knowledge, trade connections, and cultural identity carried forward by descendants who kept building in stone for centuries afterward, at more than 200 related dry stone sites scattered across the wider region, Great Zimbabwe simply being the largest and, eventually, the most famous. At Kami, the Torwa state's new capital further southwest, walls rose in decorated checkerboard and herringbone patterns, an evolution of the same building tradition rather than a break from it, still standing today as its own UNESCO-listed reminder that the knowledge carved into Great Zimbabwe's hillside never actually died with the city that first perfected it. Great Zimbabwe itself was largely empty by the time later waves of outside visitors, and eventually colonial officials, ever set foot on the plateau, leaving them to encounter only the walls, the birds, and the silence, with none of the people who could have simply told them who built it and why. The site was added to UNESCO's World Heritage List in 1986, 6 years after independence, and today its name outlives the ruins themselves in the most literal way possible. When the country shed the name Rhodesia in 1980, it chose to call itself Zimbabwe, a shortened echo of the Shona phrase Zimba Za Mabwe, houses of stone, turning an 800-year-old granite hillside into the namesake of an entire modern nation. Which is really the honest place to leave this one. We know, with complete confidence now, exactly who built Great Zimbabwe, despite a century of politically motivated insistence otherwise, and we know it functioned as a genuinely wealthy hub in a trade network stretching all the way to Persia and China. We know its decline looks far more like gradual dispersal, resource strain, and shifting trade routes than any single catastrophe. We do not know, and may never know with real certainty, exactly what that solid stone tower was ultimately built to represent, what ceremonies once took place inside the great enclosure's curving walls, or how it must have felt to be among the last generation living on that hill, watching the plateau's long centuries of prosperity quietly redistribute themselves elsewhere. What we can say, with some satisfaction, is that the stones themselves never needed anyone's permission to keep standing exactly where their builders left them, patiently outlasting every theory invented to avoid crediting the people who actually raised them.